On Christmas Eve, a pregnant woman vanished, and in a quiet neighborhood where mornings usually began with routine and familiarity, something felt wrong in a way no one could immediately explain. There was no struggle, no sound, no sign that anything had been taken by force, just a home left exactly as it was, as if time had paused in the middle of an ordinary day. A cup sat where it had been placed, personal belongings untouched, and outside a dog wandered alone without direction, as if waiting for someone who was supposed to return but never did. Her name was Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant and preparing to celebrate Christmas with her family, a moment that should have marked the beginning of something joyful, something new. Instead, it became the last day anyone could say they knew where she was, the last point where her story still felt complete. And as the hours passed and concern slowly turned into fear, the absence she left behind grew heavier, harder to ignore, until it became clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. But what made this case even more difficult to understand was not just that she vanished without a trace, it was what surfaced almost immediately after. The man who claimed he loved her, the one person who should have been searching with urgency, speaking with hope, holding on to the belief that she would come back, was already telling another woman that his wife was gone, speaking as though the ending had already been written before anyone else had even realized the story had begun. Before anyone reported her missing, before neighbors raised alarms, before investigators stepped in, there was already a version of events being shared that didn't match the reality unfolding in front of everyone else. And that detail, small at first, would later become one of the most unsettling pieces of a case that would capture national attention, raising questions about trust, about truth, and about how well anyone can truly know the person closest to them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, it seemed like a missing person case, the kind that begins with concern and hope, where families hold on to the belief that there is still time, that there is still a chance for everything to return to normal. A husband, a quiet neighborhood, a holiday morning that should have been filled with routine and comfort instead became the starting point of something no one was prepared for. Neighbors noticed small details that didn't feel right, family members began to ask questions, and slowly the realization set in that Laci Peterson had not simply stepped away for a moment, she had vanished in a way that left no clear explanation. In those early hours, the focus was simple: finding her, bringing her home, holding on to the belief that this was temporary, that whatever had happened could still be reversed. But as the days passed and the search widened, the tone began to shift, and what once felt like a situation filled with hope started to take on a different weight. Within days, it became something else entirely, something that no longer fit the pattern of a typical disappearance. Questions began to surface, not just about where Lasse was, but about the circumstances surrounding her last known moments, about the people closest to her, and about the details that didn't seem to align. Was this a planned murder, something carefully arranged rather than something that happened by chance? Why was her husband living a double life, telling another woman a story that suggested he had already accepted an outcome no one else had even begun to consider? And what really happened on that Christmas Eve, in those quiet hours when everything appeared normal on the surface but something irreversible had already taken place? Each question added another layer to the case, pulling it further away from a simple explanation and closer to something far more complicated. Because behind the image of a perfect marriage, behind the smiles, the shared plans, and the life that seemed stable from the outside, there was a truth that no one saw coming, a reality that would slowly reveal itself piece by piece, challenging every assumption that had been made at the beginning. And as investigators and the public began to look closer, it became clear that this story was not just about a woman who disappeared, it was about the hidden parts of a life that only come into focus when everything begins to fall apart, when the details people once overlooked start to matter, and when the difference between what is shown and what is real becomes impossible to ignore. Laci Peterson was the kind of person people remembered, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence stayed with you long after a conversation ended. She had a warmth that made people feel comfortable, the kind of energy that brought life into ordinary moments, and those who knew her often described her as someone who cared deeply about the people around her. She was outgoing, easy to talk to, and carried a sense of optimism about the future, especially as she prepared for what she had always wanted: becoming a mother. In the months leading up to her disappearance, that excitement became a central part of her life, shaping her plans, her routines, and the way she spoke about what was ahead. There was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that everything she had been building toward was finally taking shape, and for those around her, it felt like she was stepping into a new chapter that was meant to bring happiness and stability. Her husband, Scott Peterson, appeared just as stable, presenting himself as calm, composed, and dependable in a way that made him easy to trust. To neighbors and acquaintances, he fit the image of someone who had his life together, someone who supported his wife and shared in the future they were building. There was nothing outwardly alarming about him, nothing that suggested conflict or tension strong enough to raise concern. From the outside, everything looked right, a couple preparing for the arrival of their child, living a life that seemed grounded and secure. But appearances can hide things, and in this case, they hid a secret that would later change the way every detail of this story was understood. Because Scott wasn't just a husband, he was living a second life, one that existed quietly alongside the one everyone else could see. A separate reality built on conversations and connections that had nothing to do with the life he shared at home. And as that second life slowly came into focus, it began to reshape the narrative in a way that no one had expected at the beginning. It introduced a level of deception that made investigators question not just what happened to Laci Peterson, but what kind of truth they were dealing with from the very start. The idea that someone could maintain two versions of their life at the same time, presenting one to the world while hiding another beneath it, added a layer of complexity that made every action, every statement, and every timeline harder to accept at face value. It forced those looking into the case to consider the possibility that what seemed stable on the surface might have been built on something far less certain, and that the answers they were searching for might be tied not just to a single moment, but to a pattern of behavior that had been unfolding long before anyone realized it mattered. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson was last seen at home, in a space that still carried the quiet details of an ordinary day, a place where nothing appeared disturbed and nothing suggested that anything had gone wrong. It was the kind of morning that should have blended into the routine of the holidays, where small moments pass without notice and plans continue as expected. But somewhere between that last confirmed moment and the hours that followed, something changed in a way no one could immediately explain. Scott Peterson later told police that he had left the house to go fishing alone, describing a day that, on the surface, sounded simple and uneventful, a personal outing that carried no urgency and no connection to the growing concerns surrounding his missing wife. His account placed him away from home, away from any direct involvement, offering a version of events that seemed straightforward enough to accept at first. But something didn't add up, not in a way that could be pointed to immediately, but in a way that slowly began to take shape as investigators looked closer. There were no confirmed sightings of Lass after that morning, no neighbors who could say they had seen her leave, no clear indication of where she might have gone or why she hadn't returned. The absence of movement of witnesses of any clear path forward made the situation harder to understand. Then there was the dog, found wandering alone, still wearing its leash, moving through the neighborhood without direction as if it had been left behind in the middle of something that never finished. Inside the home, personal items remained untouched, small details that suggested she hadn't planned to go far, hadn't prepared to be gone for long, and certainly hadn't expected to disappear entirely. As each piece was considered, the gap between what was known and what was missing began to widen, turning a simple timeline into something far more uncertain. The quiet house, the empty streets, the absence of witnesses, all of it pointed toward a moment that had been interrupted without leaving a clear trace behind. And then, as the realization settled in, the situation became impossible to simplify, because Laci Peterson hadn't just left, she had disappeared, removed from the ordinary flow of her life in a way that offered no immediate explanation and no clear direction for those trying to find her. Without a trace. What followed was a national search, one that quickly moved beyond the quiet streets of a single neighborhood and into headlines, broadcasts, and conversations across the country, as people who had never met Laci Peterson found themselves drawn into the urgency of finding her. Search teams organized quickly, volunteers covered ground methodically, and flyers carrying her face appeared in places far beyond where she was last seen, each one a reminder that time was passing and answers were still out of reach. The case carried a weight that felt personal to many, not just because of who she was, but because of what she represented, a life interrupted at a moment that should have been filled with anticipation and hope. The country watched closely, following each update, holding on to the possibility that she would be found safe, that the story would turn in a way that restored what had been lost. But as days turned into weeks, that hope became harder to hold on to, and the focus began to shift from searching to understanding what had actually happened. Investigators weren't just searching for Laci, they were also watching Scott Peterson, paying close attention to his movements, his statements, and the details that surrounded his version of events. At first, his role seemed clear, a concerned husband waiting for answers like everyone else, but as the investigation deepened, that image began to change. Small inconsistencies, subtle behaviors, and the emerging picture of his personal life started to raise questions that couldn't be ignored. Because while the world was focused on finding Laci, while search efforts continued and public attention remained fixed on the hope of her return, Scott was engaged in conversations that suggested a very different understanding of the situation. He was speaking to another woman, maintaining a relationship that existed outside of his marriage, and in those conversations, he presented himself not as a husband waiting for his wife to come home, but as someone who had already accepted her absence. He told her that he had lost his wife, that he was moving forward with his life in a way that didn't align with the reality everyone else was experiencing. And the timing of those conversations made the situation even more difficult to understand because they took place before Laci had been found, before there was any confirmation of what had happened to her. That detail, once uncovered, shifted the focus of the case in a way that could not be reversed, turning attention toward the possibility that the answers investigators were searching for might not be out in the open, but much closer than anyone had initially believed, before Laci was even found. The case changed when the truth about Scott Peterson's double life came out, shifting the entire direction of the investigation in a way that could not be undone. What had once been viewed as a search for a missing woman began to take on a different weight, one shaped by deception, timing, and a pattern of behavior that no longer fit the image he had presented to the world. Investigators uncovered details of a relationship that existed alongside his marriage to Laci Peterson, a connection built on conversations and promises that painted a picture completely separate from the life he was living at home. It wasn't just the existence of that relationship that raised concern, it was the way he spoke within it, the version of himself he chose to present, and the timeline that connected those conversations to the day Laci disappeared. He told his girlfriend that he had already lost his wife, speaking in a way that suggested the ending had already happened, that the outcome had already been decided. Those words carried a weight that went far beyond a simple lie because they were spoken days before Laci vanished. At a time when no one else had any reason to believe something was wrong. The idea that he could describe himself as someone who had already experienced that loss, before it had even been reported, introduced a level of intent that investigators could not ignore. It forced them to reconsider everything, every statement, every movement, every detail that had once seemed ordinary now taking on a different meaning when placed against that timeline. That wasn't coincidence, it wasn't a misunderstanding or a poorly timed statement that could be explained away. It pointed towards something more deliberate, something that suggested foreknowledge and awareness of what was coming before anyone else had even begun to ask questions. And as that realization settled in, the narrative of the case shifted once again, moving further away from uncertainty and closer to a conclusion that carried far more weight. Because if those words were not accidental, if they reflected something he already knew, then they were not just part of a hidden relationship, they were a signal, an early glimpse into a truth that had not yet fully surfaced. That was a warning. Months later, the truth surfaced, not in a sudden revelation, but in a discovery that brought a heavy finality to everything that had been uncertain for so long. The search that once carried hope now led to an outcome that confirmed what many had begun to fear, closing the space where questions once lived and replacing it with a reality that could no longer be avoided. The remains of Laci Peterson and her unborn son were found, ending the possibility that this story might take a different turn, ending the belief that she might still be out there waiting to be brought home. It was the kind of moment that shifts a case entirely, where the focus moves from searching to understanding, from possibility to consequence, and from hope to the weight of what has been lost. What made that discovery even more difficult to process was where it happened, near the same waters where Scott Peterson said he went fishing on the day she disappeared. A location that had once been described as part of an ordinary day suddenly became central to everything, turning a simple explanation into something far more significant. The place he claimed was just a routine outing, a personal decision with no deeper meaning, now stood at the center of the investigation, connecting his account of that day directly to the outcome that followed. It forced a reevaluation of every detail, every statement, and every assumption that had been made along the way, bringing the case into sharper focus in a way that left little room for doubt. A husband, a lie, a life taken, and the quiet realization that the truth, when it finally surfaces, often arrives with a clarity that is both undeniable and difficult to accept. And even with that clarity, even with the evidence and the conclusions that followed, there remains a question that continues to linger long after the case has reached its end, one that extends beyond this story and into something more personal. How well do we really know the people closest to us, and how often do we rely on what we see on the surface without ever questioning what might exist beneath it? What do you think, after everything you've heard, after following each moment from the day Laci Peterson disappeared to the point where the truth finally came to light? Was there ever a chance this could have ended differently, or was the outcome already set in motion long before anyone realized what was happening? It's a question that stays with you because cases like this don't just end when the facts are laid out. They leave behind uncertainty, reflections, and the kind of thoughts that make you look at trust and relationships in a completely different way. Let me know in the comments what you believe, whether you think there were signs that could have changed the course of events, or whether everything unfolded exactly as it was always going to. And if you want more real stories that feel unbelievable, stories that challenge what we think we understand about people and the choices they make sure you subscribe for the next one because there's always another story waiting to be told.